3. The time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that after Senator McKenzie wrote to him about sports rorts on the 10th of April, the day before the election was called, his office requested changes to the list determining which projects were funded and which projects missed out?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll confirm, as I always have on this matter, and that was my office provided information based on the representations made to us, including information about other funding options or programs relevant to project proposals.
Members on my left, the member for Lyons, members. Members on my left, I'm not going to keep saying it, member for Spence. I just say to all members, I won't continuously keep warning members. I'm making that very clear. Ejection under 94A does not require a warning, and for those that are regular customers, don't expect surprise if you interject and you're ejected. I'm flagging that very early, and if the noise continues, I'll issue a general warning that gives me the option of naming. The member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's economic plans and stable management are ensuring we can protect Australians and our economy from global challenges like the coronavirus outbreak?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay for her question. The government, since our election in 2013, has worked incredibly hard, Mr. Speaker, to put Australia in a more secure position, to ensure that we've addressed the structural balances that were needed in the budget, to ensure that at a time like this, in a year like this, when we've dealt with bushfires and continue to do so, dealing with drought which has been ongoing for many years, and particularly now, Mr. Speaker, as we address what is the very serious issue of the coronavirus, a health crisis globally that has very significant impacts, that we can stand before the Australian people with great confidence and be able to say to them, Mr. Speaker, that while we are not immune, as this virus has now hit some 75 countries, we are as best prepared as any country can be, and a key reason for that has been the careful financial stewardship of this nation's finances, Mr. Speaker, over the last 6 years. Mr. Speaker, we have a health system that Australians can be confident in. We have borders, Mr. Speaker, that Australians can be confident in, and we have invested in the border management, Mr. Speaker, that enables us to respond to the issues that we are currently facing so swiftly, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to the economy, we have done the same. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of this virus, we have got ahead early, and we are working together with states and territories and others to ensure we stay ahead. And that in particular means working closely with the Reserve Bank. Earlier this week, as I said yesterday, the Treasurer and I and the Finance Minister are hooked up with the Governor of the Reserve Bank and the Deputy Governor to ensure that we are completely aligned as we understand the economic impacts of this health crisis, Mr. Speaker, and that we respond accordingly. The Bank, of course, will make its response, and the Government is preparing its response. And, Mr. Speaker, I would simply say, as I did at the press conference earlier today, that as the Reserve Bank considers their response today, that whatever decision they make, I would ask the big banks to respond to that and pass on in full whatever decision the Reserve Bank made today, in the same way that Qantas stepped up to the plate when we asked for their support to get Australians out of Wuhan and to get them out from the Diamond Princess. I want to thank Qantas again for the great work they did, and I simply ask that the big banks do exactly the same thing in passing on the full impact should the bank make that decision. But over these past 6 years, Mr. Speaker, with jobs growth, with ensuring that we've fixed the structural balance of this budget so Australians have been able to get jobs and restore their own balance sheet. That means that we can look through this current crisis and we can look to the other side, and we can know that the Australian economy can bounce back even better on the other side, as it will, because of the measures we have put in place and because of the measures we will put in place. That will be targeted, that will be measured, that will be scalable. They'll focus on jobs, they'll focus on keeping business in business and ensuring Australians bounce back.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. How can the Prime Minister claim he simply passed on information on the corrupt sports rorts scheme when the Audit Office told Parliament last night the list of sports rorts projects was changed after the election was called, and I quote the Audit Office here, quote them, at the request of the Prime Minister's office?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I simply say again, as I've said, Mr Speaker, in this House before and going back to my press club address earlier in the year, what my office did was very straightforward. They passed on information based on the representations made to us, and that included information about other funding options or programs relevant to project proposals. Mr Speaker, that statement is completely consistent with all of the matters that have come before this House and in other places.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House how the Morrison government is taking action to protect Australians' health, particularly children, from the outbreak of the coronavirus?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Chisholm. She has shown great leadership and strength during the course of the coronavirus outbreak within her community and within the Chinese-Australian community right across the country. And she's helped with communication, she's helped in providing reassurance, and she's been a very important bridge to that community, which has been a task and a responsibility shared by all in this House. Globally, what we have seen overnight is that numbers have now exceeded 90,000 cases of confirmed coronavirus around the world. We have now seen almost 3,100 lives lost, sadly, including the case in Australia of Mr Kwan. As part of that, we have now seen, as the Prime Minister said, 75 countries, including countries with their first confirmed case, such as Indonesia, Portugal, Saudi Arabia. As a consequence of that, what that means is that we have moved to put in place very strong protections. In particular, in relation to those protections was the declaration by the Chief Medical Officer on the 21st of January, well ahead of some of the international organisations, of COVID-19, as it's now known, as a disease of human pandemic potential. In response, that has included some of the strongest border protection measures in the world, declaring on the 1st of February that—
Member for Chifley. The Minister has the call.
Declaring on the 1st of February that we would close—
Member for Chifley will leave under Standing Order 94A. The Minister has the call.
That we would close the borders to non-nationals from China, but with other important steps along the way, including the closure in relation to Iran, once we noticed and observed the high death rate and realised that that indicated there was clearly a much higher unreported rate than was on the record. Very specifically, in relation to families and children, we have been working with the states and territories closely. The COAG meeting focused on that element, and just today the Chief Medical Officer provided this very important reassurance to families and parents that the transmissibility rate to children is low, indeed potentially lower than the flu itself, and the consequence when children are infected is low. It has a very low mortality rate, and many cases amongst children will be mild. I think it's important to provide this information to the community, to provide the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, the collective Chief Health Officers across the states and territories, and the international community, to say to Australian families, we are taking care of you and your children are safe.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that after the election was called, Senator McKenzie's office sent not one but two emails to Sport Australia allocating sports rorts funding, one at 8:46 a.m. and another at 12:43 p.m. Is he also aware that the second email at 12:43 p.m. removed one project and added 9 more?
Members on my left. The member for Rankin just needs to recall what I said after the first question. The member for Chifley obviously didn't listen. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition has simply just set out evidence that was provided in the Senate today.
The members on my left. Member for Hotham. The member for Moreton. The member for Indi has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. The North East rail line upgrade is due for completion in June next year. Currently, there is no plan to provide extra funding for its ongoing maintenance. If there is no funding for maintenance, it will again fall below Class 2 passenger standard and the entire $235 million upgrade will be for nothing. Will the government commit to providing maintenance funding for the North East rail line to keep it safe and at Class 2 passenger standard?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Indi for her question and her interest in rail and infrastructure more generally, and I thank her for the meeting we had yesterday in my office about the wider infrastructure agenda that this government is putting into place for her electorate, for regional Australia, indeed right across the nation. And I'd also, obviously, we discussed the tragic accident at Wallan that occurred on February 20 and other rail-related issues that we discussed in that meeting, and I would certainly like to pay my respects and condolences to the families, colleagues and friends of the train driver John Kennedy and pilot Sam Tanis, who were tragically killed in that derailment. It's a tragedy that no family should have to go through, and I know how important both of them were to the Australian railway community. I would say the Australian railway family, because it is a very close-knit family. Rail is important to regional people, as the member for Indi, as all regional members know, because of the vital passenger and freight links it provides to major centres and to markets for regional industry. And I'm pleased to inform the member for Indi that rail, particularly regional rail, is very important to the government. It's this government that is building the historic inland rail between Melbourne and Brisbane. It's a project which will transform the way freight moves around this country and provide economic opportunities for regional Australians for generations. And in Victoria, from where the member hails, inland rail supporting 2,800 jobs.
Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Indi on a point of order.
Relevance. The question was in regard to maintenance of the North East rail line after the upgrade.
Yes, and I'll just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, I'll call him in a second, whilst the question did have some preamble to it, it was specifically about that issue, and whilst he's had a preamble himself on matters more generally, he now needs to bring himself to the question. The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And look, the Victorian section of this nation building project is going to benefit from a $235 million upgrade between Melbourne and Albury, the North East rail line. This upgrade, funded entirely by the Commonwealth, delivered by the Australian Rail Track Corporation. The John Holland Group has been contracted. Work is already underway and major works are scheduled to begin as well, following on from that later this month.
I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister that that wasn't the question that was asked.
But it's okay.
No,
yes.
I mean I'm not. Members on my left, I'm not going to negotiate. The Deputy Prime Minister needs to address himself to the question.
Well, the result of this investment will be lifting the track standard to Victorian Class 2, as the member asked me about, Victorian Class 2 standard, allowing more reliable and faster passenger services. The ongoing maintenance funding for the North East rail line has been funded from within the usual ARTC budgets and has averaged around $6 million per year. And as the North East rail line upgrade progresses towards completion by mid-next year, the ongoing maintenance of the track is an important consideration for the commercial lease negotiations between the ARTC and the Victorian Government. And I have discussions with the Minister, Jacinta Allen, and Jala Pulford all the time about maintenance, about ongoing funding and about other issues rail-related. And this investment in the North East rail line, I know that the member is particularly interested in that, goes through her electorate, forms part of a broader $1.6 billion Commonwealth investment in the rail in the regional rail revival package that is upgrading critical regional rail infrastructure
The Deputy
in Victoria.
Prime Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for McKellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer tell us how the Morrison government is ensuring that the budget is prepared to deal with any economic impacts from the coronavirus? Is he aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for McKellar for his question. Acknowledge his background in the private sector before coming to this place, his chairmanship of the House Tax and Revenue Committee, and no one was more pleased when we on this side of the House, against the will of those opposite, passed more than $300 billion of tax cuts, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House believe the path to a stronger economy is through lower taxes, more jobs and responsible budget management. Now, yesterday, Mr Speaker, was the 24th anniversary of the coming to government of the Howard government, Mr Speaker. The Howard government. It's important to remember what they inherited and what they left. When they came to government, Mr Speaker, they inherited a budget deficit of around 2% of GDP, or $11 billion. By the time they left office, Mr Speaker, they left a budget surplus.
Just if the Treasurer could pause for a second and the member for Gorton could stop interjecting. As I've said repeatedly, we're just falling into bad habits here. I've listened to the question carefully. He can obviously give some context and some comparison. And as much as I was a part of the Howard government, the question didn't ask him about that. It asked him about the government's policies and any alternatives to them. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was explaining the importance of responsible budget management where the Howard government left a pristine balance sheet. Now, when we came to government, we inherited a fiscal mess. There was a deficit of $48.5 billion, of around 3% of GDP. Now we have the first balanced budget in 11 years, Mr Speaker. We have unemployment has come down from 5.7% we inherited to 5.3% today, and we have helped create more than 1.5 million new jobs, Mr Speaker. We have helped create more than 1.5 million new jobs, and we've passed more than $300 billion of tax cuts. And this important economic discipline will allow us the fiscal flexibility to respond to the economic shock that we are now seeing from the spread of the coronavirus. Now, quite distinct from the GFC, the coronavirus is disrupting global supply chains and is having a significant economic impact. Now, overnight, the OECD singled out Australia and Germany as two countries which could introduce additional economic measures without endangering debt sustainability, Mr Speaker. Now, that was the OECD talking about the importance of maintaining those fiscal buffers. Now, I'm asked about alternative approaches. We know that those opposite, when they were last responding to an economic shock, we saw that they spent money on pink bats, Mr Speaker, and overpriced school halls, and most recently took $387 billion of higher taxes to the last election, Mr Speaker. The importance of disciplined fiscal management gives a government the ability to respond to economic shocks like the spread of the coronavirus, which this economy now faces.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that, contrary to his repeated statements that Senator McKenzie alone determined sports rorts funding on 4 April, at 12:35 on the 11th of April, Senator McKenzie's office sent a list of projects to the Prime Minister's office, with 1 project removed and 9 new projects added, and minutes later at 12:43 p.m, Senator McKenzie's office sent the final revised list of projects to Sport Australia?
Hear, hear.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I've said before, I am not responsible for the email service in the former Minister's office, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left, the member for Isaacs.
I refer the member to the
Prime
evidence
Minister will
by
pause.
Ms.
Members will
Boyd.
cease interjecting, or they'll start. The member for Sydney will leave under 94A. It's a certain irony in actually interjecting on me when I'm asking people to stop interjecting. I mean, it's
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister
I
has the call.
refer the member to the evidence by Mr Boyd that was provided regarding the issues that he's just raised, and it says that the changes made later that day, the 1243 version, none of them were evident as it being the request of the Prime Minister's office rather than the Minister's office.
The member for Nichols.
Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is building resilience and growth in Australia, including through the creation of jobs by bringing forward investment in infrastructure projects through the rollout of the $100 billion infrastructure pipeline, including those in my electorate of Nichols?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Nichols for his question. Our $100 billion pipeline of investment over the next 10 years is helping to create around 80,000 jobs. 80,000 jobs, including the member for Nichols' electorate. We're fast-tracking construction. We're bringing forward $2.9 billion, $1.2 billion in additional funding announced. Now, this is an investment flowing through all communities, Mr Speaker, including the member for Nichols. We're building the Echuca-Moama Bridge, a $323 million project. This government is backed with a $125.7 million initial investment and an extra $28.7 million total funding. Now, the Mayor of Campaspe Shire, Adrian Weston, said the Echuca-Moama Second Bridge is the largest infrastructure project our region has seen. Benefits of the bridge will be significant and wide-ranging. In addition to the regional economic and social advantages, the community will benefit on a daily basis by alleviating bottlenecks and assisting to divert larger vehicles away from the town centre. Now, just a couple of years ago, a tree fell on the particular road, which involved a 1.5-hour detour for people, particularly families picking up their children, and this is where our infrastructure really makes such a difference, Mr Speaker. It reduces traffic congestion, improves travel times, reduces freight operating costs, and particularly for small business, it's so beneficial, and particularly when it's being constructed. Managing Director of McConnell Dowell, Jim Fritz, said he looks forward to working with the local community of Echuca and Moama. He said, retaining as much economic benefit as we can in the Echuca-Moama region by buying local and employing locals throughout construction, and our phased rollout of this project enables many local businesses to benefit, but particularly so, you just don't realise the economic benefits by the construction and the small business feeding into it. Those alone are just not the advantages that we're getting. It's also in the little things that you wouldn't expect, Mr Speaker. And the Riverine Herald had a great little article about a group of triathletes, and one of them, and particularly this will be important for the marathon runners in the chamber, the Attorney General, the Vets Affairs Minister, indeed across the other side, the member for Fenner and Kingsford Smith, who like to get out there and run. And when you have a better road project, you can run faster times. And indeed, one of the winners of this Brewburger team that won the triathlon section, he said, this is cyclist Sam Eddy, said, the legs didn't feel great, if I'm honest, but the surface was pretty quick, and I thought that certainly helped. So the advantages of infrastructure rollout are not just for small business and not just for commuters, they're also for sporting types. And I know the member for Nichols regards himself as a bit of a sporty type. The benefits are right across, and I hear them yelling out. They're excited about it too, and as well you should be, because every community in Australia is benefiting from the $100 billion 10-year infrastructure rollout that we're doing across this country.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm the list of sports rorts project was changed more than 4 hours after the election was called and caretaker conventions commenced?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, well, the member is referring to evidence that's been put before the Senate committee. What I can only advise the House, Mr Speaker, of matters that relate to the actions of my own office, Mr Speaker, and I don't have knowledge when emails are sent by ministers' offices to other places. I don't have direct knowledge of those matters. Those are matters that are attended to by the ministers who have the authorising authority, Mr Speaker, for approving those programs, which I've stated.
The Prime Minister just paused for a second. The member for Wills is warned, and I'm just going to say yet again, members on my left, at least the members on my left asking questions, expect me to be able to hear the answer. Can I just tell them all I can hear is noise? Whatever the member for Wills was saying is completely unintelligible, so no one's hearing what he says. You're just creating a wall of noise to prevent me listening to the Prime Minister. And if it's the only contribution you can make, you won't be here. The Prime Minister has the call and I need to listen to him.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And so in relation to issues that relate to the caretaker period, Mr Speaker, those opposite have put questions to the government about this. But, Mr Speaker, I remember the 2013 election very, very well. And I remember on that occasion the Secretary of Finance, David Tune, said he had to give him a formal direction by the then Special Minister of State, the member for Isaacs, Mr Speaker, where they spent $6.5 million in the middle, Mr Speaker, of an election campaign, advertising in the Sydney Morning Herald, suggesting people shouldn't come to Australia illegally by boat. So they ran the advertisements in the Sydney Morning Herald. I don't know what they were doing in terms of running advertisements up in Indonesia where the boats were coming from, but it was one of the most prolific uses of political advertising by a government in an election campaign. It was absolutely disgraceful. This leader of the opposition can only throw mud because he sits in a puddle of mud.
The Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is, in cooperation with the states and territories, responding to the outbreak of the coronavirus, and particularly how it's focusing on protecting the elderly within our communities?
Great question.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Curtin, both for her work prior to coming to this place, but in particular her focus on the hospitals within her electorate, hospitals such as Sir Charles Gardner, the Perth Children's Hospital, St John of God, Hollywood Hospital, all of which are playing a role now or have the potential to play a role. As part of what we are doing, working as a country in dealing with the challenge of the coronavirus, one of the things which happened following the medical advice, the decision of the National Security Committee and ultimately the stewardship of the Prime Minister was to implement the pandemic plan for coronavirus last Thursday. And as part of that, one of our key elements has been to make sure that we are focusing on ensuring that people who come to Australia are here without any significant chance of bringing the disease. The Prime Minister has today added to the border protection measures by referring the cases of South Korea and Italy, each of which has had recent travel advisory upgrades, to the medical experts, to the Australian Health Protection Principles Committee. That should inform our advice at a subsequent National Security Committee this week. In addition, though, in our work with the states and territories, whilst they have been focusing primarily on hospital preparedness, we have been focusing in particular on primary care and aged care and our elderly. Whilst our children, as I mentioned earlier, are far less likely to contract and in particular to suffer from a severe form of coronavirus, our elderly are much more vulnerable, and that is a global trend and a global challenge. Here in Australia, there are a series of steps that we have taken. Firstly, very early on, we've provided significant information to the aged care sector as early as the 7th of February, again on the 26th of February, but throughout there's been constant liaison with that sector. At the moment, we are working with the sector, and there are further meetings throughout the course of the week to develop a specific aged care preparedness plan. But I do note that what Mr Sean Rooney, of the CEO of Leading Aged Care Services Australia, has said is that providers are accustomed to dealing with influenza each winter and are adding to these protocols through the updated COVID-19 guidance from the Department of Health. And Pat Sparrow, the CEO of Aged and Community Services Australia, has said is that we work with a vulnerable group. So every flu season we need to be ready to support these people. It is an evolving situation, and we are constantly liaising with health authorities. That work is something which we respect and appreciate. We thank the states. We thank the aged care service providers and our general practitioners, and we are focusing as our top priority on care for and protection of our older Australians.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is again to the Prime Minister. Last Friday on ABC TV, he was asked to confirm, and I quote, "There was no direct involvement by any of your staff members in deciding where the money went in tandem with Bridget McKenzie's staffers," and the PM replied, "Of course not. In light of evidence from the Audit Office that his staff sorted out the final allocations of projects over email, will the Prime Minister apologise for repeatedly misleading Australians and this parliament?"
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I don't accept the assertions of the Leader of the Opposition. He constantly comes to this dispatch box and makes assertions and as to what things are, Mr Speaker, and those assertions are not true.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The member for Higgins has the call. I'm going to hear in silence. If anyone interjects, they will be removed. It's pretty straightforward.
Thank you, Mr.
The member for
Speaker.
Higgins has the call.
My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister outline to the House the Morrison government's clear plan to reduce emissions, whilst at the same time ensuring energy generation reliability, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions. The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Higgins for a question, and I acknowledge her distinguished career before she came into this place as a paediatrician and as a researcher, and as someone who understands the power of technology in solving hard problems, Mr Speaker. And she knows that we have a comprehensive plan to bring down the costs of energy and to bring down emissions in this country, Mr Speaker, and that plan includes the $3.5 billion Climate Solutions Package, the $1 billion Grid Reliability Fund, price caps on electricity, Mr Speaker, the Big Stick, underwriting new generation program, state energy deals like the recent deal we've done with New South Wales, the National Hydrogen Strategy, and many others, Mr Speaker. And the important point is that our plan is delivering. So we've seen now for 4 consecutive quarters reductions in the CPI for electricity prices for the first time ever, leaving more money in the pockets of hard-working families and businesses, Mr Speaker. We've seen 5 months in a row of sharp wholesale price reductions in both gas and electricity, which is freeing up cash for industry to invest in jobs, Mr Speaker, jobs and growth. Mr Speaker, from all of that, we're delivering a fairer deal for all Australians in electricity, more supply to ensure there's reliability, particularly in states like South Australia, where we saw the impact of the previous Labor government's policies, Mr Speaker. And we will overachieve on our 2020 and 2030 emission reductions targets, Mr Speaker, because we have a plan. In the lead-up to Glasgow, later this year, we'll be laying out a long-term strategy, and central to that will be the role of technology in bringing down emissions while keeping the economy strong, Mr Speaker. Now, I was asked about alternatives, and there is an alternative, and that is a target without a plan. A target without a plan, Mr Speaker. And as Sam Maiden has written in her book on Labor's 2019 election campaign, members of the Labor Party during the campaign had come to be referring to Labor's climate change spokesman, the member for Hindmarsh, as the Grim Reaper, Mr Speaker. The Grim Reaper. Now, the Grim Reaper destroys everything it touches. Destroys jobs, destroys incomes, destroys industries and communities, Mr Speaker. And certainly he destroyed the member for Maribyrnong's leadership, Mr Speaker. But, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition hasn't learnt. He's done it again. He's adopted a target without a plan. We focus on plans that deliver. The Leader of the Opposition
will remove his seat. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. Had the Minister concluded his answer? I'm just going to say to the Leader of the Opposition, he's not to jump until the Ministers concluded their answer. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. How can the Prime Minister possibly claim that his office was only passing on information when the Audit Office found there were emails between his office and Senator McKenzie's office on both the 10th and the 11th of April, and I quote the Audit Office, sorting out what the final list of approved projects would look like.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I just simply say what I've said consistently on this matter. My office provided information based on the representations made to us, including information about other funding options or programs relevant to project proposals. That's exactly what we've done, Mr Speaker. I've been very consistent in these representations. The Leader of the Opposition can be wishing and hoping it was something different to that, but he's wrong.
The member for Gellibrand will withdraw an unparliamentary statement he made. You need to refer to members by their correct titles.
Oh, I withdraw.
Yeah, and I think you're about to leave. You anticipated my next ruling, so we can do that now too. And I'll call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister update the House on what steps the Morrison government is taking to improve recycling rates and the processing of waste?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Robertson for her question and her keen interest in keeping plastic out of our waterways and out of the ocean. Yesterday we held a National Plastics Summit here in Parliament House. I was joined by the member for Brisbane, the Assistant Minister for Waste and Recycling. Part of his drive and determination is to see new processing facilities across Australia as a result of our investment. I was joined by the fabulous Reef Envoy, and he introduced 11-year-old Molly Steer, and she's a student from Cairns, and she talked about her campaign to get rid of plastic straws. We, as a government, are committed to tackling plastic waste, to clean up the environment, but also to create economic opportunities and jobs, because that's what we do. Our summit included over 300 senior members of government, industry, community sector, looking for new solutions to the plastic waste challenge and looking for further actions across industry and non-government organisations. Now, the waste sector in Australia employs about 50,000 people and generates over $15 billion a year. For every 10,000 tonnes of waste that goes to landfill, there's about 2.8 jobs. For the same amount of waste recycled, there's close to 10 jobs. So this is an economic opportunity as well as protection of the environment. And what was really exciting about yesterday, Mr Speaker, was the way industry stepped up. Some of them just out of nowhere, it seemed, with pledges, with promises, with investment, with dollars. Our packaging group, Pact Group, announced $500 million of investment in recycling. That will divert 2 billion plastic containers from landfill by 2025. And I know they're in the member for Robertson's electorate, where they're recycling about 300,000 wheelie bins. Retailer Coles announced more money to treble the amount of soft plastic it collects as you go in the supermarket in its Red Cycle program. Nestlé will partner with company IQ Renew in a trial that again will see more soft plastics turned into packaging. McDonald's is phasing out 550 tonnes of plastic cutlery, and Australia Post has pledged to make plastic post bags out of recycled material by 2020. So to see these organisations step up and make that commitment to recycling was extraordinary. Following Clean Up Australia Day on the weekend with Pip Kearney, we used to pick up that rubbish and think about just putting it in a hole in the ground. Now we know that plastic we pick up off the ground is a resource. It can be recycled, it can be remanufactured, it can create jobs, and it can do extraordinary things to the Australian economy. So we saw national leadership in the National Parliament, and we are committed to fixing our plastic waste problem to stop hundreds of tonnes of waste going into landfill. And this is one of our most significant policies on recycling, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is again to the Prime Minister. Why has the PM repeatedly told the Parliament and the Australian people the decision on the Sports Rorts project was made on 4 April, when the Audit Office has found the list of Sports Rorts projects attached to that brief kept changing until hours after the election was called on the 11th of April? Isn't it absurd to claim a decision was made on 4 April when the list determining which projects were funded and which missed out was still changing a week later?
Hang on. Members on my left. Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, well, the member has raised comments and statements I've made in this House regarding this specific matter around the 4th of April. Let me say what I've said in this House. The evidence provided today that Sport Australia advised the committee this morning that they received a brief from Senator McKenzie dated 4th April 2019. That was the evidence. That's what I said. The authority, and a later question, the authority for approving those projects was signed, dated 4 April 2019. The testimony today from Sport Australia, another response, was that they received a brief from Senator McKenzie dated 4th April 2019. It was authorised by the Minister for April 2019. That's when the approval was given. Mr Speaker, I've been very clear in this House about when that authority was provided for that brief, which was on the 4th of April. And so, Mr Speaker, I don't think it would be any clearer that a Leader of the Opposition seeks to come to this dispatch box and Mr Speaker, treat question time as smear time, to treat question time as baseless assertion time. And, Mr Speaker, the Australian people can see through a Leader of the Opposition who is so desperate that he has to resort to smears and assertions when the real issues that Australians are facing today, Mr Speaker—
The member for Cooper and Cowan, the Leader of the Opposition, on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The quotes are from the Audit Office.
Yes.
And in order to be relevant, he needs to talk about—
No, the point of order is—
relevance.
Okay. The Prime Minister has the call. He's being relevant to the question. I was listening to— I'm not going to have commentary reflecting on the chair. The Prime Minister is being relevant to the question asked that included a preamble. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, more than a preamble, I dealt specifically with the reference to 4 April 2019, which was the specific question which was put to me about that matter.
I just say to the Prime Minister, I was actually agreeing that you'd been relevant.
Very good. Thank you.
I was actually,
thank you, Mr Speaker.
Whether it's good or bad, I said you were relevant.
That's fair enough. So. Mr Speaker, what we're seeing from the Leader of the Opposition today, they haven't come into this place and addressed the big issues that the Australian people today. Yesterday in this House, members on this side came to this chamber and wanted to know what the government's response was to address the very serious issue of coronavirus in this country. Not one question for the opposition about that, Mr Speaker. Not one question about that yesterday, Mr Speaker.
Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Point of order, the Prime Minister is not abiding by your earlier ruling on relevance.
No, I want to make it clear. I said that the Prime Minister was being relevant. Manager of Opposition Business. Those behind the Manager of Opposition Business, whatever they interject, I can assure you he doesn't hear it or take any account of it, and I'm trying to listen to him. The Manager of Opposition Business.
You gave an earlier ruling saying precisely why at that point the Prime Minister was being relevant. What he's going to now are issues entirely outside of that ruling that you gave.
The Prime Minister is entitled to compare and contrast, which he's doing, and as I said earlier, the question had some preamble in it. It also had what I'd call an element of character attack, for a better term, and that's not uncommon. I'm not going to try and make question time something that it's not, but I'm going to keep hearing from the Prime Minister in response to the question.
Speaker, our government are going to keep focusing on the issues that seriously matter to the Australian people, whether it's the coronavirus, whether it's responding to the bushfire crisis, which it's dealing with the drought, as we prepare for the budget, getting skills into Australian employees and so they can grow our economy and we bounce back strongly, whether it's the plastic summit or getting emissions down, Mr Speaker, or providing certainty in our electricity system around the country. Those opposite want to come in here and engage in political smears. I know they're used to doing that in their own caucus against each other, Mr Speaker, but if they're not interested in the serious issues confronting the Australian people, Mr Speaker, there is no wonder why the Australian people have no confidence in the opposition or this Leader of the Opposition.
The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister outline for the House how the Morrison government is ensuring that Australia leads the fight to combat child exploitation?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and for support of the government's very determined policy to make sure that we can keep Australian children safe. Mr Speaker, we've invested more money into making sure that we can keep kids safe online, to make sure that we can defeat the scourge of paedophilia, whether it's in the real world or it's online. And I'm very proud of the fact, Mr Speaker, that we've been able to invest $70 million in the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, which is a world leader. It's recognised as such. And, Mr Speaker, it's brought together not only state and territory jurisdictions but also international partners to make sure that we can work to stop the very dreadful business of children being sexually assaulted for those pedophiles here and overseas. Mr Speaker, in December of 2019, the ACE Child Protection Triage Unit identified a case along with their agency partners, which was a particularly egregious case. And one of the things that we need to do in our country is to recognise the extent of this problem. It's not polite to talk about children being sexually abused when we're in discussion in any setting. It offends all of us. And it is something that we need to talk more about because it is happening every day. There are children that are being sexually abused online for the gratification of Australians and others around the world. It is perverse behaviour and it's proliferated because of the use of the internet. And we know that in many cases the police can't access the details because the messages have been encrypted. The use of technology is working to the advantage of the criminals and pedophiles in this space. And we have done all we can and will continue to do all we can as a country to make sure that we bring those pedophiles to account. I want to make sure that all Australian parents can have confidence when their kids go online, the hours and hours that they spend on their devices, that they're not being groomed, that they're not being photographed or that images aren't being taken and transmitted around the world, because for young boys and girls, those sexual images are multiplied thousands of times across the internet, and those children are effectively, Mr Speaker, offended against on each of those occasions. And I want Australians to be aware of the extent of the problem. In December last year, as I say, there was a case where a 48-year-old male from Queensland was alleged to have filmed his own actions, engaging in sexual acts with his son, and he posted that online, trying to identify further offenders that he could engage with. I want to pay tribute to all of those officers who involved themselves in this very difficult area of police investigation and make sure that people know that this is an issue that our Australian public needs to talk more about, and to make sure that together we have a concerted effort both online and in the real world to make sure that we can protect Australian children.
Yeah. The Leader of the Opposition.
Firstly, Mr Speaker, can I associate everyone in this parliament, certainly on this side, with the minister's comments, and particularly those people acting on the front line. This is a tough job that has an emotional and mental health impact on them, I am certain. We need to, as a parliament, do everything we can to keep kids safe.
Yes, the Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion, that the House 1 notes that at 12:21 p.m. on 10 April 2019, Senator McKenzie's office sent a letter from Senator McKenzie to the Prime Minister attaching a list of sports rorts projects she intended to approve. B. At 8:30 a.m. on 11 April 2019, the election was called and caretaker conventions commenced. C. At 8:46 a.m. on 11 April, Senator McKenzie's office emailed the approval brief dated 4 April 2019 to Sport Australia with a list of approved projects attached. D. According to the Audit Office, between 12:21 p.m. email to the PM's office on 10 April and the 8:46 a.m. email to Sport Australia on 11 April, one project had been removed and one project had been added, quote, at the request of the Prime Minister's office. E. At 12:35 p.m. on 11 April, Senator McKenzie's office sent a different list of projects to the Prime Minister's office, with one project removed and 9 new projects added. F. At 12:43 p.m. on 11 April, Senator McKenzie's office sent the approval brief dated 4 April to Sport Australia with the final revised list of approved projects attached. The Audit Office found there were emails between the Prime Minister's office and Senator McKenzie's office on 10 and 11 April, quote, sorting out what the final list of approved projects would look like, end quote. H. The Audit Office confirmed that although Senator McKenzie's approval brief was dated 4 April, the list of approved projects attached to the brief kept changing up until 12:43 p.m. on 11 April. I. The Prime Minister has repeatedly claimed his office simply passed on information about sports grants and claimed the projects were approved on 4 April, but this new evidence proves beyond doubt. The Prime Minister was up to his neck in decisions on his corrupt sports rort scheme. The approval brief, dated 4 April 2019, kept changing up until 12:43 p.m. on 11 April, and the final list of approved projects wasn't sent to Sport Australia until 4 hours after the election was called and caretaker conventions commenced. And 2, therefore, finds this Prime Minister has repeatedly and deliberately misled the Parliament and the Australian people about the corrupt sports rort scheme.
Is leave granted? The Leader of the House.
Leave is not granted.
The Leader of the House.
Standing orders be suspended, as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion immediately. That the House 1 notes that A. At 12:21 p.m. on 10 April 2019, Senator McKenzie's office sent a letter from Senator McKenzie to the Prime Minister attaching a list of sports rorts projects she intended to approve. At 8:30 a.m. on 11 April, the election was called and caretaker conventions commenced. C. At 8:46 a.m. on 11 April, Senator McKenzie's office emailed the approval brief dated 4 April 2019 to Sport Australia with a list of approved projects attached. D. According to the Audit Office, between the 12:21 p.m. email to the Prime Minister's office and on 10 April and the 8:46 a.m. email to Sport Australia on 11 April, one project had been removed and one project had been added, quote, at the request of the Prime Minister's office, end quote. E. At 12:35 p.m. on 11 April, Senator McKenzie's office sent a different list of projects to the Prime Minister's office, with one project removed and 9 new projects added. F. At 12:43 p.m. on 11 April, Senator McKenzie's office sent the approval brief dated 4 April to Sport Australia with the final revised list of approved projects attached. G. The Audit Office found there were emails between the Prime Minister's office and Senator McKenzie's office on 10 and 11 April, quote, sorting out what the final list of approved projects would look like, end quote. H. The Audit Office confirmed that although Senator McKenzie's approval brief was dated 4 April, the list of approved projects attached to the brief kept changing up until 12:43 p.m. on 11 April. I. The Prime Minister has repeatedly claimed his office simply passed on information about sports grants and claimed the projects were approved on 4 April, but this new evidence proves beyond doubt, 1. The Prime Minister was up to his neck in decisions on the corrupt sports rort scheme. 2. The approval brief dated 4 April 2019 kept changing until 12:43 p.m. on 11 April. And 3. The final list of approved projects wasn't sent to Sport Australia until 4 hours after the election was called and caretaker conventions commenced. And 2. Therefore, finds this Prime Minister has repeatedly and deliberately misled the Parliament and the Australian people about the corrupt sports rort scheme. Mr Speaker, it is very clear that this Prime Minister has misled Parliament
the Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that the member no longer be heard.
Question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Order. The question is the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I put the honourable members for Nichols and Gray tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Werriwa and MacArthur tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 74, noes 68. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded? The Manager of Opposition Business.
Seconded. It's colour-coded corruption and it goes right to the Prime Minister's office.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I haven't called the Leader of the House yet. I'm just going to make clear to all members for the Leader of the House to move this motion that someone be no longer heard. They actually have to have said something so they can be no longer heard. So that's why I needed to hear first from the seconder. I now call the Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that the member no longer be heard.
Question is the member be no longer heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. I ring the bells for 1 minute. And I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. And as this is a successive division, members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or leaving the chamber, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 74, noes 68. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is the motion be agreed to. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Caught red-handed. His office,
the Deputy Leader
his
of the Opposition
decision.
will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I move that the question be put.
Leader of the House has moved the question be put. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. And again, I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or leaving the chamber, in which case they need to report to the tellers. Lock the doors. Appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 74, noes 68. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. So the question now is that the motion moved by the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. The ayes will, all those of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. We'll ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Question is the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. What the honourable members for Macarthur and Werriwa tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Nichols and Gray tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 68, noes 74. The question is therefore resolved in the negative. Members just can take their seats. We're still in question time. I'll call the member for Bowman in a second. I'm just waiting for the crowd to take their seats. The member for Bowman.
Thank you, Speaker. Question to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer update the House on today's decision by the Reserve Bank and any responses to their decisions?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Bowman for his question. I can inform the House that earlier today the Board of the Reserve Bank of Australia has reduced the cash rate by 25 basis points to half a percentage point to support the Australian economy in the face of the spread of the coronavirus. I'm pleased to announce to the House that both Westpac and the Commonwealth Bank have passed on the 25 basis point rate cut in full, Mr Speaker, responding to the Prime Minister's call. And now I call upon the other banks to pass on the rate cut in full. Mr Speaker, as the noted economist Chris Richardson has said, both fiscal and monetary policy are supporting economic growth, and the country is coming together in face of the significant economic shock that we face, Mr Speaker, and we welcome the announcement today by both Westpac and the Commonwealth Bank, and we call on the other banks to follow suit.
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and on